All right, time for another episode of Platonic Apologetics. We're still looking at the same debate that we've been doing. This is the fourth one we've done on a debate that was on Telegram called Paganism versus Platonism. And we're going to be taking a look at some of the final arguments in it. Most of it's going to be about the forms and sort of about Platonic metaphysics. So there's still about an hour left in the debate from where we left off before. And so there's going to be a little bit of jumping around I'm going to try to shorten it up. This one might be a little bit longer than the other videos, but I kind of want to get through the rest of this debate. There's a lot of the same points reiterated over and over again in the argument. So I think we can probably speed through a couple parts of it and get to the end of it. But that's going to be the main focus of the debate, really, is talking about sort of the relationship of mind to reality and other aspects of Platonic metaphysics and critiques on those. So let's jump right in then.
So the intellect is superior. Mind creates reality, right? This is something that you said over.
Yes and no, not our individual minds. All of reality this is a good analogy to use. It's as if, like, when you're sleeping, right? You create all of reality with your mind in your dreams, right? This is an analogy. I don't mean this literally, but this is how you understand it. We are each the dream of the noose experiencing itself, right? So
we're fake. We're dreams.
This is going to be how most of this debate is going to go, where S is going to say this is an analogy, and then he goes, so it's literally exactly what you just said. We're fake. We're dreams. It's like there's a lot of that.
Like I said, it's an analogy. What I'm saying is, the intellect is in all people and in all things, right? So everything that is not conscious is sort of just an object of intellect, and everything that is conscious is both an object. We are objects. We are bodies, but we also have thinking. We're a subject. So the noose is both at once subject and object, or subjectivity and objectivity. So we don't create the world. I don't create the world with my mind. You don't create it with your mind. If you died, everything would still be here the same. Same with me, right? But in the sense that all of reality is creation of the nous, which is Plotinus calls it a dual aspect unity, like divinity. So in the sense of dual aspect, thinking and thought and different forms. There actually is multiplicity in being, in nous, in reality, which Imperium Press is like, he criticizes Platonism, and you as well. You said that, like, reality is this one. That's more of like a Parmenidean thing. Platonism does say that in reality, necessarily, like, one and multiple are like mutually implicative. You can't have one without the other.
Yeah, I'm really glad that S brings this up. It's a great point to make when people are trying to reduce Platonism down to monism. And Parmenides is more the guy that's a monist more than anything. If you read the Parmenides, he talks a lot about sort of his monistic philosophy. And the truth of the matter is we're influenced by Parmenides, but we're not Parmenideans. And so we don't take this hard sort of monistic stance on things. It's like we mentioned in the last video on evil, that there's this sort of dual aspect unity, non-dualism of monism and dualism in harmony. That's really the key to understanding Platonic metaphysics. So I think as a primer, we may as well kind of jump into a little bit of this stuff as far as Platonic cosmology goes. I don't want to use this graph the entire time, but I do just want to show sort of the core areas of what we're talking about when we're talking about Platonic metaphysics and the understanding of the relationships between things. And so what S is really saying here is pointing out that there's these different levels of reality. And from a Platonic standpoint, the nous, or the mind, is really the highest level, other than the one, of course, but the highest level as far as being itself. It contains the forms, and it is the sort of archetype of reality, you could say. In between, you have the soul, and then that informs the material. And so I've never been a huge fan of these particular graphs. This one here is, I think, from Jeffrey Kupperman. And it's okay. It's good for explaining all of the little different parts of Platonic metaphysics and getting some precision in there. But I find it tends to make people think that these things are less interrelated than they are. It gives this impression that it's like very much so separate levels. And so the way that I usually try to explain it to people is a little bit different. I look at it more from this standpoint, and I kind of call this nested cosmology. And so, and you could really take that form from before, that graph of the chain of being before, and do something similar to this if you really wanted to. There'd be a lot of things you'd have to write in here, but it would work, it'd be like lots of concentric circles. But that's really the core way to understand Platonic metaphysics. And it's going to make everything make a little bit more sense if you think about it that way. And so when he's saying mind is the sort of ground of reality, or the thing that is most primary, this graph really gets to the point of what that means, in that the soul is encompassed within mind and the body is encompassed within the soul. Right? So each is like a concentric sort of universe, one in the next. And the materialist vision of the universe is kind of the flip of this, the exact opposite. And towards later in the video, I think we're going to go over that, like explain exactly materialist metaphysics versus Platonic metaphysics in more detail. But basically, it's the opposite of this, right? The body, it creates motion, and then out of the motions of the body produces the mind. That's the kind of materialist way of looking at it, where the Platonic way is the exact opposite. We're saying mind creates the soul, creates the body. So that's going to be important. It just is a sort of primer to all of this. And one of the ways I describe it is really like Russian nesting dolls. Each thing kind of within the next. If you had to think about how this all kind of plays out, you could think about the noose being the outside of the whole thing, right? Then the next doll in would be the soul, the next doll in would be the body, and so on and so forth. So, all right, let's let him continue.
I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the things is, no matter where you look, how big or how small, there's multiplicity present. There's different basal particles that build up the universe as we see it, right? There's multiple different kinds of planets, stars, galaxies. There's multiplicity all the way up and all the way down. And some things like universals, like what is a universal that most people would say is a universal? Gravity, right? Gravity is a universal. When you jump, you come down.
Okay. So this is going to go into a long stretch. Where he's going to talk about how gravity is a universal, but let's just get this out of the way right now. Gravity is not a universal, right? It's not a Platonic form. That's not what we mean when we say a Platonic form, just something that is universal in the universe necessarily. We have to kind of go a little bit higher up ontologically to understand really what it is. So unfortunately, the rest of his argument ends up being kind of a straw man argument, because he's not really talking about what we're talking about. I'll let him get further into it before we kind of break it down a little bit.
Right. But is it truly a universal? And what I mean by that is, if that's the case, and by the way, each and every one of you can look this up, the gravitational map of Earth, it does not conform to geography. You will see that there's regional variations. One of the ones that I made a post about was one in Alaska, where it looks like this glacier from space and from a helicopter, because you can go and visit it. It looks glitched. It doesn't even look real.
Yeah, I'll show you guys a video of what he's talking about, so you know what we're getting into here. What he's talking about is this, which is the Malaspina Glacier, which does look really strange. And there's this, the gravitational map of Earth showing that, yeah, gravity does affect the Earth differently It's not uniform throughout the entire Earth. Doesn't seem to be uniform throughout the entire universe. It's got kind of peaks and valleys of where gravity might be a bit stronger or a bit weaker. And in this case, this is causing an anomaly in this glacier where it does this kind of striping, where it kind of goes back and forth because of the way that gravity moves in that particular area. So pretty interesting phenomenon. I'm going to see if he's got anything else to say about this.
Right. And there's these gravitational anomalies. So I have to ask, are there any true universals? Because there's, as the old maxim goes, there's always exceptions to the rule. Therefore, the rule can't be truly universal. Even though exceptions to the rule don't discount the rule, it does provide that it isn't a catch-all. It isn't a true universal where there are no exceptions.
So it's really interesting the way he's constructing this argument, because he's taking something that isn't a form and isn't a universal, and then trying to say it's a universal, and then pointing out why it's not a universal. So it's like, well, yeah, you pick something particular. Like we could do this with triangles, for example, right? We could say, well, you say that there's this form of a triangle, but no triangle in reality is an exact perfect triangle. If I went and got a microscope and looked at all of the different examples of a triangle, even one that was made most perfectly with the highest level of precision on a machine that's made for exact precision molding, I could zoom in and there would be tiny variations on the edge. So it wouldn't be a perfect triangle the way that you're saying that the forms are. But that's the exact argument that we use to talk about the forms and say, yeah, there's no perfect form in reality, in the physical world, right? There's nothing in the physical world that will perfectly match the forms, and yet they're still recognizable as forms, right? So in the case of gravity, for example, there's not going to be a perfect form of attraction that is everywhere in the universe. It's going to have some variations because it's in the material world, and everything in the material world has these little bits of variations, but it's still gravity. It's still this intelligible form that we can look at it, despite all of its changes and variations. We go, that's still gravity. Same thing happens with apples. It's like there's millions, billions of different types of apples out there, both just different kinds of apples you can get, and then the individual apples themselves. And they all vary slightly. No two apples are exactly identical. And yet we still recognize them as intelligible objects that are apples, right? So he's kind of making our point, I think, more than not. So this is what I'm saying here with the triangles, right? So there's the form of the triangle, and each of these is going to relate to a different level in the ontology that we looked at, the sort of, in the broad sense, the mind, the soul, and the sensible material universe. And so if we start with the sensible at the bottom, it's like there's all these different examples of triangles in the universe, everything from, road signs to Doritos. And none of those are perfect triangles, right? But that suggests that there's still an intelligible quality to each one of them that is the sort of form of a triangle, right? They participate in that idea of the form of a triangle, even though none of them is exactly perfect. And I'm going to abstract this out a little bit and get to the gravity part and talk about that specifically. But if we're talking about something a little more of a form, which I would say beauty is a more primary form than triangles are. And we'll get into, I think, a little bit of the hierarchy of forms here in a second, so you know what I mean more. But let's just talk about beauty itself. This is where it gets a little bit more complicated, because, triangles are a simple thing that we can hold in our minds. So a lot of times when we're talking about forms, people will use things like triangles. They'll talk about a triangle, a tree, an apple, cars, books, just intelligible objects, essentially. But the primary forms are more than just intelligible objects. They're sort of the formal realities that would create the needed elements of an intelligible object. So beauty is a much more intangible form. So when I'm talking about beauty itself, the way that it exists in the intellect, it's not like a triangle where I can just show you a shape of a very very precise triangle, and you kind of get what I'm saying. Beauty doesn't have any sort of tangibleness to it the way that a triangleness does. It's a much less tangible thing. And yet that makes it a more primary form, because everything participates in some level of beauty, right? But the way that it takes its form in reality and in physical reality is very, very different, right? You've got all of these different things, from a butterfly to a flower to a beautiful woman on her wedding day and a beautiful sunset. It's like, what ties these things together? I mean, if I showed you all four of these things, what do these things have in common? It's kind of hard to grasp, because it's such a universal that they share in, but they share in this universal idea of beauty, that they invoke beauty in our minds. We look at them and go, wow, these things are all beautiful. So following that down to getting into gravity, gravity itself is not a form, and it's much further down. It's actually in the sensible realm, gravity itself. And if we want to talk about the form of gravity, it would be something more like attraction, the form of attraction, or eros, something that binds things together and brings things into some kind of union. That's really the force that we're talking about, right? And so in the nous, as the form itself, we're talking about attraction. In the soul, there'd be some sort of essence of gravity, which would be similar to the functions of it, the movements of gravity, and how it would work perfectly. But the way it actually comes out into the material universe is something like gravitational fields. Magnetic fields are similar to this as well. But these gravitational fields are particulars. They're not the form. So he's really just making a categorical error here, and he's looking at the variations in something in the sensible world and saying, see, this negates the reality of the forms. But the fact that you can sit there and talk about gravity despite its variations shows that there is a universal behind it, right? Like if you're going to say, oh, well, gravity has a fluctuation here and it's stronger here and it's weaker here, and then it has these little variations. It's like, yeah, what has the variations? Gravity does. And you recognize, even despite the variations, that it is still gravity. Just the same way as when we're talking about the triangles, whether I see a road sign that's a triangle or whether I see a Dorito that's a triangle, I both realize that they're triangles, regardless of how different they are. You know, one of them's made out of corn, one of them's made out of metal, and they're not exactly the same shape either, but I can still recognize the form of them in it nonetheless. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about the forms. And so I think this whole argument's kind of a weak argument.
What would you say to that?
I'm going to jump ahead.
I don't know if I was fully following on your
fine.
logic there. I'll just be brief, and then
But there are no true universals, and there's multiplicity all the way up and all the way down. It doesn't funnel toward one, which is what Platonism posits. That all the multiplicity that you see around you is a consequence of one emanating 12, emanating 36, emanating, a billion trillion different things. So why don't we see this funneling up to one? Why do we see, no matter where we look, multiplicity, no matter how big or how small?
Okay, so that's a pretty good question from, and asking just like, why is it there's so much multiplicity? Why is there so much variation? And this really gets into what we're talking about with the forms and the layers of reality, is that these things do collapse down into these universal principles. So like I was saying with gravity, it's like, yeah, you're going to see these variations of gravity or variations of triangles in the world. That's the multiplicity aspect of it. And yet each one of those things shares in a more universal concept. And if you sort of extrapolate that idea out all the way, you can see that everything that exists exists because of its participation in more universal concepts, more universal forms, right? And then you get into this question, if you keep questioning, okay, all right, you accept that part, you go, well, what about like the form of forms? Or what's the ultimate form? And that's when we get to things like the form of the good. And we start looking at the one itself. And we'll probably touch on this again later, but I think there's a big problem with his kind of pluralistic way of looking at the world, because the number one problem we're going to have is if he's going to suggest that the only thing that's in the universe is multiplicity, then there's no way to account for why we experience all of those things in their multiplicity. So to put it another way, there can't just be multiplicity, because there's something that all of those multiple things share in that makes it you as an individual capable of recognizing them. And that thing is reality. Yes, there's a million different multiple things, and there's this manyness, this unlimited manyness that's all over the universe of all these different myriad things. And yet somehow you share the same reality as all of those things, right? And that's really what Platonism is getting at here, is that yes, there's many, many things, and yet somehow all of these things are sharing the same space or reality. And that shared space is this unity that we're talking about. So it's difference in unity. And again, this goes back to S's term that he was using, this dual aspect unity, right? There's this manyness and there's this oneness, and they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. They're bound together, and it's both one and many at the same time. So we'll probably address that a couple different times, because I don't think throughout the entire debate, this guy really grasps that concept. And I'm going to jump ahead from S's response, just because I think he's going to say more or less what I just said. So let me jump ahead. They get into some further ideas here about, dirt. We start talking about dirt as far as universals go. So the conversation continues a little later.
Is all dirt the same?
Is all dirt? I don't know. I feel like that's like a geological question. I don't know, but I'm just trying to make like a.
My goodness, I wish I had my old textbook. It was about soils when I was in undergrad, and there are different layers, different components to soils. There's more sandy, there's more clay, there's more biomass, right, in soil, and it's the mixture of these that creates different types of soils, right? The ratio between sand, gravel, clay, silt, and organic material. So there are different types of soils.
So the core argument we're going to get into here is that that all things are composites of things. That's the argument he's trying to make, to show that there are no universals because everything's just parts, right?
Right. You can't just plant a tree in anywhere on Earth and expect it to grow, because it's particular. It requires particular nutrients, particular temperature, particular humidity, and all the rest of it. So in other words, there are different, like, for example, with growing, there's different hardiness zones where certain plants can thrive and others will not, depending on your latitude, soil type, and all the rest of it. So that kind of blows a hole into soil's just soil, because there's many different types.
Yeah, so I find it really interesting that he brings up this whole kind of argument about dirt and soil. And unfortunately, S, who's the Platonic guy in this whole thing, had kind of brought up dirt and mentioned dirt as being this like intelligible object. And it's funny that he used that as an example, because really when we're talking about Platonism, it's one of the few examples we have that in the Platonic dialogues where it's mentioned that dirt literally isn't a form, that there is no form of dirt, right? And this is the kind of the finer point I want to get to about the forms. And as far as apologetics go, when we're talking about these kind of things with people, I understand the shorthand that we go to equate like intelligible objects like a car or a book or dirt, and then equate that to sort of an eternal form of that thing. But I think this is an example of where kind of we shoot ourselves in the foot with that example if we pick something that is a little too mundane. And this goes right into this I believe it's in the Parmenides. I didn't write down what it is, but I'm pretty sure it's Parmenides. So let me show you what I mean. So yeah, they're talking, and also said Parmenides, abstract ideas of the just and the beautiful and the good and all such conceptions. So yes, he replied, and is there an abstract idea of man apart from us and all others, such as we are, or fire or water? And I have often, he replied, been very much troubled, Parmenides, to decide whether there is an idea of such things or not. And this is where we get into it specifically, all right? And are you undecided about certain other things which you might think rather ridiculous, such as hair, mud, dirt, or anything else particularly vile and worthless? Would you say that there is an idea, like a form, of each of these distinct and different from the things with which we have to do or not? And then Socrates says, by no means. No, I think these things are such as they appear to us, and it would be quite absurd to believe that there is an idea of them, right? So what we're getting at here is that things like dirt don't have some sort of eternal form in the nous. They might be intelligible objects because we can name them and we can know, okay, dirt is dirt. We know what dirt is, but that doesn't really mean that they are actual eternal forms. That's kind of giving them a little bit too much credit. And so I kind of broke down what really separates a form from an intelligible object here, just so we understand the terms. And this is going to help when you're in an argument with somebody about these sorts of things. And in this case, when we're listening to him talk about forms and objects, I think this will make more sense. So the key things about a form is that it's eternal. So the forms exist outside of space and time. They're not subject to change. Most people understand that concept. They're universal. So it's a universal concept. So in this case, like the form of beauty encompasses all beautiful things. They have this sort of causal aspect to them as well, right? So understanding that things are participating in it in a causal sense. And there's also a sort of simplicity to them as well, that they're singular and indivisible. You can't really break them down any further, right? And so from a Platonic standpoint, these are like the primal aspects of the universe. You can think about it like the periodic table of the universe from a Platonic standpoint, right? And the reason why this is different than an intelligible object is that most intelligible objects are really like composites of forms, right? They take in multiple different aspects of form. So, if we're talking about an intelligible object like a book, for example, they participate in the forms, but they're not identical to them, So, for example, a specific triangle is an intelligible object, and it reflects that form of triangularity, but it's not the form itself, right? And even when we're talking about things like a book, for example, it's like a book participates in all sorts of different forms in order to be a book. And so it's much further down. It's much more differentiated. It's much less simple than a true form. It's like a complex of forms, a bunch of different forms that come together to form something that is intelligible that we can understand. But I think we do ourselves a little bit of a disservice sometimes when we're focusing more on the intelligible objects and kind of treating them as forms, when if we focused on the more primary forms, things like truth, beauty, goodness, I think we do ourselves a little bit better to show the universality of the forms. But it's harder to talk about that, so I get why people don't do it. I don't do it all the time, so I understand. So really, that's the key thing to understand between these two things is, in one case, we're talking about the forms have this eternal, universal, causal, and simple sort of nature, and intelligible objects are more participatory in the forms in multiple different forms. There's a multiplicity to that. They're more complex, and there's dependence that they have on higher forms for their reality to exist. So they're not quite exactly the same. Now, you could maybe just say that they're like lower level forms, but I like making the separation here between a form and an intelligible object. I think it just clears up the difference between these two things, and that they are quite different when we're talking about them.
Yeah, there can be different types of it, but it's like forms within forms, right? Like soil is a thing. Like even if you don't know all the different types of soil, you can recognize soil. And then, what you just said just demonstrates the forms. You said that there's like all these different types of soils and like different sandiness, and I forget what you said, but you just stated like a bunch of intelligible qualities that can belong to different types of soils. Like that's just what the forms are. They're just intelligible ideas that exist in everything. And everywhere that you might find a particular set of soil, right, it's just composed of different universals. That's what particularity is, just different universals in something.
Yeah, so this is kind of exactly what I mean. In this argument, I think drawing a distinction between an intelligible object and a more primary form, like S is getting to that point, but I think if the point were more well defined about how an intelligible object like dirt participates in forms of, participates in the form of being, participates in the form of sort of like chemical compositions and things like that, things that are higher up in the chain, then it makes a little bit more sense, I think. But it's all right,
So you could have, yeah, go ahead.
But are universals truly universal?
Yeah, I
Or
don't know.
are there such things as anomalies, things that don't fit our expectations?
Yeah, so the key thing here is that an anomaly in the physical universe does not negate the universality of the forms in any way. In fact, it's the variations in the physical universe that are part of why we are positing the forms in the first place. Is that there's something universal in it, despite the fact that of all the variations that are in the physical universe, right? We're saying, hey, a triangle is still a triangle, even though it takes a million different forms and variations, it's still a triangle at the end of the day, right? Something that's beautiful is still beautiful, whether it's a person or a butterfly or a sunset. There's something that they share. They share this form of beauty, and they're vastly different. They don't really have any other commonality to them but that. And so that's really what we're saying, is that, this particularness is really what suggests that the forms do actually exist.
So like when we're talking about the universal forms, we're talking about intelligible ideas. We're not talking about like necessarily things that matter. I'm not really sure what you're getting at.
Are there true universals? And the reason why I brought up the gravitational map is because there are anomalies. There are areas where gravity is weaker and stronger. There are places where the gravity is so weird that it creates a glitched appearance on the surface. How can that be if gravity, for example, is a universal force with universal, like it's a pure universal? How can there be anomalies?
Yeah, I mean, it really, again, it's just gravity is not a universal, and he's mistaking a particular thing for a universal thing. There's not the same thing.
If that's the case.
So look, this is like an area of knowledge that I have literally no knowledge on. So what you're saying is that like gravity is less strong or more strong in certain areas?
Correct. By the way, you can look this up.
No,
It's the
I trust you. I'm
gravitational.
not disputing it. I'm
Yeah.
just not sure.
If you look up the gravitational map, and by the way, what I will do here is show you a picture. I will post it on my channel real quick here and repost it so that everybody can see what I'm talking about. Alaska. Okay, so I'm going to forward it here.
Okay. They're going to go more on into this. I don't know if I want to keep going with that. I think I'm going to jump ahead past the gravity part. I think we've kind of gotten past that. We understand why that doesn't work the way that he thinks it works. So I think we're just going to skip ahead. He starts talking more about true universals in just a few minutes. So we're going to jump ahead to that part then.
Right. But if it was a true universal, there would be no anomalies, deviations, exceptions to the rule, things of this nature. It's not a pure universal. And that kind of goes to the crux of the forms, right?
Because it could be different. What if gravity is just...
The forms are pure universals. Just like gravity is considered by most to be a pure universal. And yet there are numerous anomalies. We're still figuring it out. Some people don't even think gravity exists. We simply don't have a clue. But what it does show is that a pure universal doesn't actually exist in real life.
He's actually right about that. And this is one good point in this whole thing. Is that the universal forms, the forms do not exist in the material universe as themselves. That's the whole point that we're making. That's why there needs to be this nous, the mind itself, where these can be eternally imperfect the way that they are, because we're always participating in them, and yet they're not anywhere in the universe either. They're in the physical universe, right? We don't see them anywhere. You'll never find a perfect universal here. That's not how they work, because the physical universe is a reflection of the forms. And so all we get is this sort of reflection of them. We don't get them in their essence, except in the intellect. We can grasp them in the intellect. And in my mind, a triangle is a triangle all the time. And it's perfect in my mind. But that's the only place where it's true and perfect, is in the intellect. So in a way, he's like kind of getting really close to the point, but then just kind of missing it there. So anyways, I think that's enough of the gravity thing. I forgot he went back into that. So we're going to jump ahead again to them talking about how the one is irrational. This is going to be the next part. Let's see.
Right. And there's multiple things with multiple identities. It doesn't funnel into the one or out of the one.
But no, there are
Because
multiple
one of the
forms.
things that
No
you
Platonist.
said, hold on. One of the things that you stated was that the one is indivisible or undivisible, right? But yet it emanates all these different things, indicative that it divided into different things. Or option B is that it is above multiplicity and it's above rationality. In other words, it's irrational by definition. If something is not rational, it is irrational by definition. I have with me here the 3 laws of logic.
Okay, we're going to get into the 3 laws of logic here with him. But this is how he starts off with this whole argument. So he's going to go into a whole line of argument of talking about how the one is illogical and violates the laws of logic. I'm going to show how that's not the case. But right off the bat, we're getting back into this problem. In the last video, we talked about this a bit too, that I don't think he understands transcendence and what transcendence really means. He got very close to that idea, saying that maybe it's this principle that's beyond multiplicity. But then he kind of drags it back into this dualistic framework where if he goes, well, maybe it's beyond rationality, but that means if it's beyond rationality, then it must be irrational. And it's like, no, that's not what that means. And let me show you an example of what I'm talking about here. So if we're talking about this whole concept just logically, right, we can talk about a transcendent principle and then things that are within it. So, you can make whatever you want to be A or B here, really. So he's saying rationality. If A is rationality and B is irrationality, then there's a transcendent principle above both of them that produces both rationality and irrationality, right? That would be a transcendent principle. And in this case, that's really what we're saying about the one. It is beyond, it's a transcendent principle to the entire universe. And if that's the case, then if you say it's not A, that doesn't mean that it's B. It's this other transcendent principle above both of them, right? And he's going to fail to grasp this concept the entire time. And I use this as an analogy with the alphabet, where if you've got A and B as literally the letters A and B, right? If something is not A, that doesn't mean that it's necessarily B, right? It can also be this transcendent principle. But I'll let him get into the first law of logic because we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. So
This is what you're taught in Logic 101. There's the law of identity, A equals A. There's the law of non-contradiction, which is A cannot equal B, or not A, excuse me. A cannot equal not A. And the law of excluded middle. What is that? The law of excluded middle essentially says that a logical proposition can either be an affirmative or a rejection. It can't be some gray area middle ground. Otherwise, you have to rephrase the question. And part of the reason why I asked in the beginning of this exchange if Platonism is truly logical is that it violates all three of the basal axioms of logic, right? A equals A, but A equals A, but A equals everything, including not A, right? And that violates the law of non-contradiction, which is A cannot equal not A. If everything is one, then A and not A are the same. And when you have different axioms, different propositions, those are different things, right? So if monism, everything is of the one, including contradictory statements, such as A is a turtle and A is a dog, right? If you have both of that, those are mutually exclusive. However, if all is one, then even contradictory statements are indistinguishable. They're the same.
Okay. So this is where this what we're talking about here is going to be really important. So he's trying to say that because the one contains all things, then that somehow means that all things are the same, and that's what that ultimately means. But that's not the case. And you can see this really simply if we just look at something like this transcendent principle. And what I'm going to use is the alphabet in relationship to actual letters. And this should be pretty clear what I mean. So you can have A and B here, but you could have literally all the letters of the alphabet if you wanted. And then there's the transcendent principle that binds those things together, which is the alphabet itself, right? And so A and B are not the same thing, and you could say just the same A and not A are not the same thing, right? Those things are different. And yet A and B here are both part of the alphabet, right? They're both things that are within the alphabet. And the alphabet contains all of the letters. All of the letters of the alphabet are contained within the alphabet. And yet the alphabet is not any one of the letters, right? You can't say the alphabet is A, and you can't say that A is B. All of these things, these are three different things fundamentally. There's the alphabet, which contains all of the letters as a unified idea of the letters of the alphabet. And then there's the individual letters of the alphabet. And you can really just extrapolate this idea to the universe. And that's really how we're conceiving of the one, is that it's the transcendent principle of the entire cosmos. And so there's many, many, many things. And we're not saying that dogs are cats or that a person is a dog. We're not saying that. Those are like the different letters of the alphabet. They're all different and they're all unique unto themselves. And yet each and every one of them is a part of the alphabet. And the fact that the alphabet binds them together into a unity doesn't mean that they become identical to one another, right? And he makes this kind of further down in this argument too. He makes an even crazier claim that's this same sort of mistake. But if we keep this transcendent principle in mind, it's really clear that we're not violating any laws of logic. He's just making a false equivalence between what a transcendent principle really is. It's not saying that all of these things are the same. It's a unity that binds and then transcends all of the things within it, right? Just the same way as the alphabet transcends any individual letter.
What Platonism and monism by extension does is it erodes differences that make distinctions in order to say that all is one, even though there are differences that make distinctions between these different objects. So I have to ask you, is Platonism truly logical, or is it as uh, or is it just a phantasm of the mind?
Yeah, so it's a great example of making another mistake about Platonism here, where we're not monists. And it's important to understand that Platonism is not the same thing as monism. And he takes this very sort of neo-Advaita Vedanta perspective on Platonism that is not what we're saying. This idea that like all is Brahman and everything is the one, or everything's the same, right? That's not what we're saying. And we're not saying that they're all of that same substance. Difference is real. If anything, what makes Platonism unique, especially compared to something like an Advaita Vedanta, is that we have things like the forms, which the forms are the primal differences in reality. And we're not saying that those forms are fake. In fact, we're saying the exact opposite. We're saying these forms, these differentiations are like the most real thing. And yet they're still unified ultimately. There's an ultimate sort of unification through the one that transcends it. But the differentiations are real. Just the same way in the alphabet. It's like the letters of the alphabet are different. And we're not saying that they don't exist. We're not saying they're illusory just because we can recognize that they're all a part of the alphabet, right? So you can have a unity and you can have differentiation and manyness. They're not mutually exclusive the way that he's trying to make it out to be. So S gives a response to all of that. But again, we're going to jump ahead, or else we're going to take forever on this one.
The one produces being, right? Correct or incorrect?
Yes.
Okay. So the many come from the one. True or not true?
I would prefer to say the divided comes from the undivided. That's my preferred way of stating it.
Okay.
And there's a technical difference, but
That's fair.
go ahead.
That's fair. So A and not A come from the one. True or not true?
A and not A come from the one. What does
You
that
could
even
say
mean?
a rock and not a rock. You could say like a rock
Yeah.
and a person.
Yeah.
Right? They come from the
Yeah.
one.
Yeah.
Okay. But a rock is not a person. In other words, you can write this down logically as A equals not A because they come from B. True or not true?
Wait, A is not A because they come from B?
Yes. A and not A emanate from the one.
Yeah.
Which we will call B. Right? So in other words, you could write this down as 4 different objects, A, B, C, and D. You can, whatever objects you can.
Yeah, but
right? So if they
Okay.
all come from the one, they are all equivalent to each other, meaning A equals B equals C equals D. In other words, A equals not A. That is the
No,
law of
because C
non-contradiction.
is the laws of logic itself. It's not a participant in itself.
Yeah, so S ends up making this kind of argument in here that the one is the laws of logic, and therefore, you can't sort of bind it to the laws of logic. And I get where he's going with that line of reasoning, but I think in this case, it makes it really difficult in this argument because the kind of logic, if you want to call it that the pagan revivalism guy is using, doesn't really make sense. You can tell the confusion on in S, and if you're listening to that and squinting and going, I don't really get how that makes sense. It's because he's failing to grasp that idea that I was talking about before with the alphabet, right? That the idea of a transcendent principle. He's trying to put everything on the level of the alphabet, right? And he's trying to even take the one and put the one on the level of the alphabet. And that's really like what it would be like. It'd be like saying that the last letter in the alphabet is the alphabet itself, right? And then therefore the alphabet can't be A, or it can't be the same as A or B or any of these things. And so it creates this contradiction. And it's like, yeah, that would create a contradiction if the alphabet itself was a letter. And this would create a contradiction in Platonism if the one were a being, but the one isn't a being. In it transcends all beings. And so there's no contradiction there. So You know, if he's talking about the three laws of logic, so we can put this into kind of logical language for everyone, just so you understand what I'm saying, which is that, you know, if we look at the law of identity, for example, something is what it is. And he's trying to say that there's an identity problem here, because the one is somehow, it is A and not A simultaneously. But really all that's saying from a logical standpoint, or what we would say in response to that, is that the transcendent one is identical to itself. And in some sense, it's the principle of identity itself, right? And so there's really no contradiction there. And he keeps trying to say that we're equating the one with other things. And yeah, that would be a problem if we did that. If we said that the one is a rock, and a rock is the one, right? That would be a problem, because rocks are not the one. But that's not actually what we're saying. So this whole thing's a straw man argument. We understand that the one is identical to itself. It's not identical to every individual thing or any particular thing, right? It transcends them all, right? You cannot ascribe it to any one of the things within being, or even all things as one. Even that's not the transcendent one, right? So this is really where he's running into all of these problems. And, you know, if we go look at some of the other things, you know, he's trying to say this law of non-contradiction, which really is exactly what I was just saying as well. Is like a thing cannot be and not be at the same time in the same respect. And this is really where he goes wrong, is in the same respect is what he's missing here. So the transcendent one does not affirm or negate being in a conventional sense, and transcends both affirmation and negation without contradiction. This is transcendent principles, right? When you understand what a transcendent principle is, these contradictions go away. And so this is getting into part of the reason why I understand why S probably didn't go into this. It's like, even I had to stop for a moment and like just think about the laws of logic and in relationship to the one to put this together really quick. And it's not something I would probably even do on the fly, but it's good stuff to know. Like if you can memorize this kind of stuff, if somebody's going to try to bring it up in an apologetic situation and try to say that the one violates the laws of logic, just know you can bring these up and it doesn't violate the laws of logic at all, if you really just think it through. Even the law of the excluded middle here, same issue. We don't really get into it in this particular debate, but if you want to take a look at that, make a screenshot or something, if you ever need to use it, it's there. So
why does it violate? Huh? Why does it violate the laws of non-contradiction?
It doesn't violate. It is the law of non-contradiction. The law of non-contradiction cannot violate itself. That makes no sense.
Why does the one produce A and not A from the same source?
Okay, that's
because what that means is that A equals not A, which is explicitly forbidden. And by the way,
okay, let's go back to our analogy on the alphabet. Why does the alphabet produce both A and B? That means that A is B. That's his argument, right? And that doesn't make any sense at all. Like, it's completely illogical. The fact that the alphabet transcends all letters does not mean that all letters are identical. That's not what that means at all.
Is there ever an instance where A equals not A in real life? The answer is no.
Yeah.
You could try, but A equals not A. A does not equal not A is the law of non-contradiction. But in Platonic theory of emanation, A and not A are produced from the one, meaning that A and not A were at one time the same thing.
So this is really a key point. So this is a mistake that he's making when he says, at one point, A and not A were the same thing. And S goes on after this and makes a really great point about how in the one, it's not like it's like a singularity in like we have in science, right? When you're talking about the Big Bang, where it's like in the one is all things compressed together into like this ultimate unity together, crammed, and like dogs are cats and cats are dogs, and all the forms are bound together as one uniform or something like that. that's not what the one is. It's much more what I've been talking about with this sort of relationship of the alphabet to letters. It's transcendent. And again, I don't think this guy grasps the concept of transcendence. Like the only thing he can grasp when it comes to the one is just super compressed everything all mashed together. And it's like that's not what we mean when we talk about the one. And so that's really where a lot of this misunderstanding comes from, is just failing to
And
grasp
are
that
the
core
same
concept.
thing through participation with the one.
Well,
So
no,
you
because
and your opposite
yeah,
are the same thing.
I'm gonna explain how that's wrong. Um,
I'm going to let S explain it because I think he does a pretty good job, and this only takes a minute.
so a book is not a desk, right? But these are things in being, right? So if you're talking about the level above being, then neither book nor desk exist. So it's not like they were the same thing and then they became different things. They don't exist prior to being. They don't exist in the one. The one is pure indivision. It's like pure. It's a mystical philosophy. It's pure unintelligible. But I can
But I
give you
thought you
reasons.
said they come from the forms.
Sorry, I'm sorry. Can you repeat? Can you
So
clarify?
so the book on the desk are emanations from the form of the book and the form of
Yes.
the desk, which
Yes.
both emanate from the one. So does
Yeah.
it come directly from the one, or does it come from the forms?
So this is another good example of what I meant by why it's nice to make a distinction between forms and intelligible objects here, because it's a little bit easier to explain when you're talking about the forms do ultimately come from the one, but when we're talking about the primal forms, there's a hierarchy of forms. It's not like the one just goes books and like books come out of the one or whatever. Like that's not exactly how it works. You get the primal forms, things like truth, beauty, and goodness, and then further down the line, there's more primal forms that kind of build and get more complex until finally you get to a point where you can have something like an intelligible object like a book. But it's not just straight up books flying out of the one or whatever.
Well, so the form of book, right, is transcendent in each book, but it's also like it's transcendent to each book and it's also immanent in each book. So like what that means, all that means in simple language, each book is a book. It has the idea of bookness, and that's why we know it's a book and not a desk, right? So the form, the idea of bookness is both above each book and in each book. But yeah, the form itself by itself, as the Platonists say, the truest aspect of it, yeah, emanates the physical particular book. But when we're talking, yeah, we're talking about just the forms, just for now. The form of book, the form of desk, those are different. Plotinus says that reality is multiplicity and unity. It's like a dual aspect, kind of like unity, multiplicity kind of thing, because everything is some one thing, but in being, it's one self. It is not anything else, so it implies multiplicity. Yeah, these things are mutually implicative, and then at the level of the one, these things don't exist distinctly. So like it's not like the chair or sorry, the desk and the book of the forms of them rather are equal and then they become unequal in being. They are always unequal. They're different forms. And then above being, they don't really exist distinctly. It's just the one.
Yeah, that's a great summation. I really like the way that he put that. Um, Shocker, I don't think PR is going to grasp what he was trying to say. The pagan revival guy is going to understand that. So we're going to see how this all shakes out. But it's a shame when having these kind of arguments that this one and this whole thing becomes this really long, drawn out straw man argument of trying to equate Platonism to monism, and it's a little exasperating to listen to as a Platonist sometimes because it's like beating a dead horse with the same thing over and over. But it's really all I can say is that I wish he was addressing what we're actually saying rather than just trying to equate Platonism with monism again and again and again. But I think he's about to do the same thing again.
So there are no such things as differences on the scale of the one, right? Differences don't
Yeah.
exist.
Yeah. Yes. There's no
Okay.
differences at the scale of the one.
So
That's why I prefer calling
has that philosophy ever influenced the likes of people who say that one race, the human race?
Okay, I want to stop here really quick because this is what this is all about. This is a little mask drop moment in this entire debate, and I just want everyone to understand this is why there's this contingent of people that are really hard anti-Platonists like this guy. Not saying that there aren't legitimate objections people can have to Platonism. There are. But in this case, with this guy, this is his real objection, is he sees Platonism as some sort of roundabout way to promote like multicultural globalist politics, and that's why he doesn't like it. And he tries to draw this comparison all the time. When you really pay attention to his arguments, this is the core thing that he doesn't like about Platonism. And unfortunately, it's a complete straw man. Like it's a complete nonsense argument because that's not what Platonism is saying. But he's suggesting here, do you think these ideas ever contributed to this particular idea? You know, that's what it's sad, but it's like in a lot of ways, this isn't even really about philosophy. It's, for a lot of these people, it's politics. And they look at philosophy as an instrument of politics rather than seeing politics as an instrument of philosophy. And that's a fundamental error to make philosophically. And it's unfortunate.
Yeah. Arvo made a video recently about the metaphysics of race where he talked about this. But his argument is that it's a misinterpretation. This is a perfect example of the problem of evil. They take what is supposed to be good, right? Unity on the human level, but they pervert it and make it evil because they don't know how to get there properly. You don't achieve human unity. Arvo says this in his video, go watch it. You don't achieve human unity by dissolving all differences. You achieve it through integrated concentric unity. So like Russian dolls, the family, the neighborhood, the community, the nation, the race, humanity. It's integrated. The differences aren't destroyed, but they're integrated in each other. This is a perfect example of the problem of evil. The left wants this pure unity without integration because they're mistaken at aiming at the good and they fall into evil, right? We know what the good is, this concentric integrated unity, and we try to follow that.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's 100% correct. Like, that really is the core of how to understand these things, not only in the political sense of what he's talking about, that like the real goal should be this sort of diversity and harmony, right? And we get that by honoring differences, not trying to dissolve them, right? And that's the true point of understanding Platonism correctly, even on a political level. But then on a theological level, this is the same thing. It's like we're not dissolving difference in the world into this monistic philosophy where everything is the same. Quite the opposite. We're allowing the forms to exist and this differentiation to exist. And it's that differentiation through the forms that is sort of the beauty of the universe come alive. And that also does require some sort of harmony with the whole. And so it's this difference in harmony with the unity and that tension between. And, you know, unfortunately, this guy just wants to kind of collapse one into the other to make his argument against Platonism. But this is fundamentally not what we're saying.
So if differences don't really exist, right?
Right? See what I'm saying? Like it totally ignored what he just said and what we've been saying about difference and unity and all of that. And just goes, okay, so differences don't exist. It's like, no, that's not what we're saying.
In real life, meaning like at the highest metaphysical level, differences don't actually exist. All is one, right?
Again, it's just more of the same mistakes over and over again. So sorry if this is getting pedantic, but you know, he's thinking about the one as all things as one, which is not the same thing as the one which transcends it, right? So it's just failing to grasp that transcendence again.
Am I mistaken or mistaken?
At the level of being, this is like Parmenides' argument. I don't think this is a Platonic argument. Plotinus is against this. Eric Pearl specifically says in the end of his book that there's a difference between this like Parmenidean thing that we're like all one, and the Platonists had like a dual aspect unity to reality. But I get your critique. Your critique again is that we're supposed to reach this undivided, the one above being, but being
Well,
in
that's
itself
the
is
goal of
division.
Platonism. The goal of Platonism is
Yes.
to reunite with the one, to be absorbed into the one, to erase all of
Yes.
your differences that make distinctions.
No, not through erasure though, but through integration. There's difference.
Yeah, this is another big one. Again, this is kind of one of those Advaita Vedanta points where he's basically trying to say that that we have this same Advaita Vedanta belief that it's like, no, you just merge into Brahman and disappear, and that's the ideal is that you disappear or become nothing, right? And that's not what we're saying. Even henosis, right? Union with God is not something that is the erasure of the self. And Plotinus even says this. It's like you're still sort of other to it, but you're as unified as you can be. And it's one of the core differences between Platonism and Hinduism, I'd say, is that our ultimate goal is not that erasure, but it is more of a unified existence, like finding our harmony within the whole. And so, again, I think he's just totally misunderstanding this.
You can't erase differences. That's illogical. Like,
Right.
differences without difference, there's no being. But you do is you integrate the differences. Yes.
I love that you brought that up, because that is the crux of why Platonism, number one, is not paganism, but also has this weird metaphysic where differences don't matter.
Again, this guy he's like a dog with a bone. Like, differences don't matter. You guys don't think differences exist. And then S is just continually being like, that's not at all what we're saying, man. He goes, yeah, exactly. I'm glad you brought that up, because you don't think differences matter. It's like, he's not even listening to him at this point. The guy's having a conversation with himself. It's
and
pretty
this
wild.
is abhorrent to us, because how we distinguish ourselves from another is by the differences. So I love to make this argument because it's fun. And
this argument is crazy, by the way, so pay attention.
I can make the argument that your father and my father are secretly the same person. And the reason why is because your father had a job and he begat you, a son. That's cool. He did that with me too. And he had a job, and I bet he went to that job with a vehicle. Ooh, that's very specific. And that he went to a petrol station to fill up his vehicle with petrol. That is very specific. In fact, so specific that the chances of that being different is minuscule, right? Therefore, your father and my father are the same person, right? Differences are illusory. They don't really matter. They just muddy things. But here's the problem with that. The reason why that argument fails is
because it's absolutely crazy and nobody's making it.
Because I deliberately ignored every possible difference that makes a distinction. And when we dig into the details, we come to find out that there are different things. Okay? There are multiple things. So,
yeah, nobody's making that argument. Like, literally no one. I've never heard any philosophical argument that just suggests that everything's all exactly the same and there's literally no differences whatsoever, except maybe some forms of like neo-Advaita Vedanta, like I said, where it's like, we're all one, man. Everything's the same. It's all, difference is illusion, that kind of idea. But again, that's not Platonism at all. And even if you talk to most of the Advaita Vedanta Hindus, most of them will tell you that that's not really what they believe either. They're not exactly, right? That the illusion of Maya is not quite what people make it out to be a lot of times. But regardless, that's not what we're saying. I don't know who this argument is for, or who would be confused about two guys who go to the gas station and have jobs. And that means that they're literally the same person. Like, no one's saying that. So it's bizarre.
In the world of metaphysics, there's really three options. There's monism, right? All is one. There's dualism, which is all is two, right? There's two things: good, bad, light, dark, male, female, right? Or plurality. See, I'm a pluralist. And
Okay, let's jump into this one. So this is good. We're getting kind of the core of the problem. Again, at least he's just coming right out and saying it, that he thinks that Platonism is monism, despite the fact that S has said it's a dual aspect unity multiple times. And really what that is non-dualism. And so there is another category that he's deliberately ignoring or doesn't even know exists, which maybe he doesn't know, because like he clearly doesn't grasp the concept of non-dualism, like what it really means. So yeah, there is monism. Monism is the idea that, yes, all is the same substance. And there's lots of different types of monists out there. So, you could be like a sort of theological monist, if you were, like I said, with Advaita Vedanta, like everything is Brahman. All things are Brahman. And then you could also be a materialist monist, like most scientific atheists are materialist monists, where the only thing that exists is matter. Matter is the only thing that exists. Everything's made out of matter. But there's a really key detail to point out the flaws in monism. And monism's a bad philosophy because it can never encompass the totality of the universe. And you can notice this by things that all monists end up doing. Every single monist will always deny a part of the reality and say that it's illusory. So, for example, when we talk about the sort of Neo-Advaita Vedanta stuff, where, hey, everything's Brahman, what do they say about reality and difference? Oh, it's Maya, it's illusion, it's all illusory. You think there's differences there, but there aren't really differences because everything's really just Brahman, right? It's an illusion. And eventually that illusion will go away and everything will just be the one again, or Brahman again. Okay, so you have to take this whole part of reality and shuttle it off into illusion. But the funny thing is, the same thing happens with material monists as well. You get a scientific monist who says, no, everything's matter. All things are just matter. And then they get to something like consciousness. And what do they have to say about consciousness? It's just an illusion. It's this sort of illusion that pops up in your mind. It's not really real. It's just all of the things going on in your mind. It creates what they call emergent properties. It's an emergent property of matter. It's not real. It's just kind of this like illusion that's popping out of your mind, but it isn't really there. Once your brain dies, it's all over. It was all just an illusion of the mind, right? So they have to make an illusion out of that as well. I think Daniel Dennett put it the best in Breaking the Spell, this material monist idea. He said, yes, there is a soul, but it's made of a million tiny robots. So that's the kind of material monist idea. It's like, oh yeah, you have this experience of a soul, but it's all just robotic chemical reactions and things going on in your brain that you're mistaking for a real thing. So they always have to deny something. That's the monist kind of position. Dualism, we don't have a lot of genuinely dualistic philosophies, really. Even Christianity is not really totally dualistic, but you could say like Zoroastrianism or something, that there's like a totally good God and a totally evil God. And then he's going to get into pluralism. But before we get into that, let's just point out again that Platonism is non-dualism, which means that we're monism and dualism in a unity, a dual aspect unity. So yes, we do understand that there is sort of like an ultimate monistic aspect of the universe, that like everything is being, right? All the things in the universe have being. But then there is this dualism. There is this thing opposed to being. There is non-being. But ultimately that duality between them is that's what's illusory, if anything, right? That those things are ultimately unified together through the transcendent principle of the one. But let's talk about pluralism.
Paganism is a pluralist proposition because it states that there's more than one and more than two things.
Okay, you're not even arguing against a straw man. Like, you're literally arguing against a philosophy that doesn't exist, or at least that's not Platonism.
Well, but Platonism is monism because all is one and all emanate from the one.
Okay, monism is a modern term. It can't be retroactively applied to this kind of philosophy. Everything I just said, like I repeated,
that's why I said it's monistic. All is one because all emanates from the one.
You can't retroactively apply this term. No, I already explained from Plotinus himself.
So how is it not monism?
It's not
How is it
because
not monism?
I just explained to you how being necessarily is division. This is logical. This is what Plotinus says. Uh, what is not division is whatever is beyond being. That is undivided. Because division is intelligibility, right? To know something is to divide it from the rest of reality, and that's what it means for anything to be. The one can't be known because it is undivided from anything else. So you can't pinpoint it. You can't pull it out of the mosaic, right? So Platonism doesn't say that being is one. Being is a total continuity in terms of like it doesn't end. There's no end to being. There's nothing like outside of being that makes no sense. But the one emanates being as its undivided self.
So if the one emanates being, then it's not a being, meaning it
Yes.
doesn't exist.
Yeah, it
Because
doesn't
what is
exist.
existence? Hold on. What is existence other than being? Right?
Nothing.
Because a rock can exist because it has being, as you say. I exist, you exist because we have, quote, being, right?
Mhm.
But if something has no being, it can't exist.
Yeah, I mean, at some level, he's right, but we keep kind of going back to that problem of like not grasping the transcendent principle type. It's literally like he's kind of trapped within the binary uh, view of things. Like if something is either being or non-being, and it's just one or the other, it has to be just one or the other. He can't really conceive of this third transcendent principle that unites the both. He's failing to grasp that. And in some sense, it's like, well, I guess I get why you're a pluralist, because it's like you're failing to understand how unities even work, like how something can be unified. But I mean, we see it all throughout reality. It's not just in that sort of alphabet example that I gave, but like even looking at like a human body, it's like I have a body, I'm a person, but you could also look at my body and say, well, it's really just a billion different cells. And it's like, yeah, it is a billion different cells. And they're all individual and they all have their own thing going on, but they come together in a unity. The me as an individual, I transcend all of the individual cells of my body. And you could pull out any one of the cells in my body and I'm not any one of the cells. And yet I'm this unity that transcends them all. So it's just one of those things I don't know if he's ever going to really grasp.
Therefore, the one, the Platonic one, where their entire metaphysic relies upon, doesn't exist by its own philosophical standards. And
Yeah, I
in
should've-
fact, that's what the dialogue of the Parmenides is all about. He even says that the one is one and nothing at the same time.
Yeah, he says the one neither is nor is one, which is true. It's what we're pointing to is transcendence. And that's the core idea that he's really failing to grasp overall. So let's go ahead and we're going to jump ahead because, again, it's one of those things that's just getting kind of pedantic to listen to.
You say that the one is indivisible or undivisible, but the many and one are present simultaneously. That there are many things participating in the one thing, which is everything simultaneously. And like I said, that violates non-contradiction, because you can have A and not A in the one at the same time in the same place. Now, the only way to rectify this is to say
the only way to rectify this is a transcendent principle, which this guy's having a really hard time grasping.
that differences are erased. In other words, that differences are illusory, which is exactly what monism and Platonism,
Again, saying Platonism is
from
monism
Plotinus downward, really try to promote. That all is one, that you and your sister are one, that
We're not saying
you
that.
and a tree are one, that
Not saying that
you
either.
and a rock is one.
Not saying that either.
And that's just not real life. Okay. There's another thing too, which is funny in Platonism, which is the sense of lower intellect. And I'm going to posit two examples that Plato gives. The first is that animals do not possess intellect and they do not possess souls. This is quite concerning, but it's quite funny also, because we have seen chimpanzees, for example. We have videos and pictures and studies of chimpanzees building shrines out of hollowed out tree trunks. They hand pick certain stones of certain sizes and colors, and they put them in these shrines and they worship at these shrines.
So I've always thought that the animal intelligence kind of arguments really ignore some of the vast differences between animals and humans when it comes to intellect. But just to address this point about Platonism here, yeah, we generally don't think that animals have a rational soul, meaning that they don't have intellect the way that we do, which is really the ability to be self-conscious, the ability to reflect on our actions. And, you know, animals don't necessarily sit around and think like, man, I wonder why I did that the other day. You know, they don't think about themselves in that way necessarily. But even if they did, that wouldn't really be a problem. Like, we're not saying they don't have souls. I don't know where he's getting that from. Animals very much do have souls. There's a tripartite understanding of the soul, that there's this sort of vegetative soul that we have, like even trees and plants have souls, which is a vegetative soul. There's an animal soul that we recognize that generally animals have, which is this sort of non-rational soul, which doesn't mean that they're, it doesn't mean they can't think or make a decision. They absolutely can. But what it means is that they don't have that like self-consciousness about them, that ability to like reflect and meditate on things, which is the process of philosophy, really. Like, their dogs are not going to do philosophy, is essentially what we're saying. And there's a fundamental difference between a human's mental capacity and a dog's. But also, even in the Timaeus, he used this quote earlier in one of the earlier videos to try to say that like Platonism, it was some early form of transgenderism, because in the Timaeus it says that people will change bodies from a man to a woman in between lives, depending on how they live their life. But if you keep reading that line in the Timaeus, he says after that, and then after changing into a woman, they may change into an animal, they may, and kind of beast, which is really more of our Pythagorean idea that's adopted into Platonism. And so there's some debates amongst Platonists about whether the soul really does transmigrate into animals or not, but it's certainly not like beyond the pale when it comes to Platonism or anything. So let's keep going on this one.
We see animals holding funeral rites, from birds to dogs, and all manner of creatures performing funeral rites, indicative and doing things that are, quite honestly, smarter than some people. Right? I've seen animals act smarter than some people. In fact, I'm pretty sure everyone here has seen the meme of the gorilla who could do sign language scoring a higher IQ than some nations, in fact. But there's also a lower intellect inside of your being, which is your gut, right? And Plato says that it is the stomach that controls basal emotions, such as sex, such as hunger, desire, and these things are controlled by the stomach. And in a sense, that's true. Credit to Plato, because we know that gut bacteria in particular can really influence how you think and how you act and how you do.
Yeah, I mean, Plato's not making some kind of comment about gut bacteria. I don't know what he's getting at, really. There's the appetitive level of the soul, which is sort of our most base desires, right? You need to eat food. That's probably why he's associating it with the stomach, is because it's related to like you have a desire to eat food, and you need to have a desire to eat food in order to keep your body going. And you need to desire sex because the race needs to continue propagating. We need to have these desires, and if we don't, then the human race ends, right? Or you as an individual end, because you stopped eating. Like, it's an essential desire. It's just a lower order desire to rationality, right? A good example of this might be something like, you shouldn't let food override something that's more important, right? If you're in a situation where you have a choice to either go walk and get a cheeseburger or save your child from dying, which one should you choose? Even if you're really, really hungry, you can rationally understand that your desire for the cheeseburger is of much less importance than the need to save your child, right? Like, we make these kind of rational distinctions. So it's just about ordering your intellect and ordering your soul to say that reason is the thing you should listen to the most. You shouldn't listen to your stomach over reason. Same reason why you shouldn't eat a giant cake, right? Your stomach is probably like, hey man, eat that cake. That cake looks great. But you shouldn't do it because rationally, you know, well, if I eat that cake, I'm probably going to feel sick. I'm probably going to get fat. I'm not going to do that. So that's really all that means.
And so, but if that's the case, it's not a separate thing. It's in concert with your brain, right? And another thing that's weird about Platonism is that you are not your body. You pilot a meat suit. This is common among a lot of axial age religions where your
just want to point out, I think we're going to have to do a whole other video on this, like, axial age philosophy as far as it comes to like Platonic apologetics. There's a few other videos floating around there talking about axial age and pre-axial age. So we'll address that later. It's a bit too much to get into right now.
Body is just a meat suit. Your soul pilots it, and when you die, it leaves and gets absorbed into the noose or the one or whatever.
Yeah, that's not what we're saying. We're not our body in the ultimate sense, but it's also, it's a little more complicated than that. It's not as simple as just saying like, oh, your body is nothing or something like that. Like it's a meat suit that you're piloting. That's the really crass way to put it. And, you know, our physical bodies are reflections of our souls in the material universe. The reason why we say we're not our body is that our body is transient. It's obviously going to die. It's ephemeral, right? You're not going to get to take it with you. If you are your body, then that means when you die at the end of your life, it's lights out. Then we're atheists, right? Then we're just saying that all that we are is material. Then we become material monists if we're going to say that we are our bodies. And what we can say is that there's aspects to our identity, right? There's the aspect of the soul. That's the immortal aspect of who we are. And then there's the material aspect, which is our bodies, which is ephemeral and transitory and dies, right? The mortal and immortal aspects of it. That's all we're saying, is that there's these different aspects to who we are. And it's interesting. I wish I could actually debate this guy and ask him some direct questions about this, because it's like, if you don't believe in that, if you don't think that you have an immortal soul, or at the very least like a spirit that outlives your body, then what exactly are you? Are you just like a material monist? Are you just a materialist then? I just failed to see how this even falls into a religious mindset, if that's what you're really going to say. So it's a little incoherent in my mind.
The thing about that is your mind, right? Because that's what Platonists posit, is that your intellect is your soul, is your being. That is what participates with the nous, which participates with the one, right? So your highest form is your brain, your intellect, but
the brain is not the intellect. Let's make that perfectly clear. And there's a mistake. Somebody who has a very materialistic mindset is going to make that mistake, but the brain is not the intellect.
We know from people who've had brain damage, people who've had brain surgery, people who have had certain procedures or cancers in the brain, that you can change your entire being based on changing the physical aspect of your brain. That you as an individual will change. It's one of the most horrifying but true statements about brain damage, is that you can become a totally different person if you hit your head hard enough.
Yeah, so this actually proves our point more than his. You know, when pointing out that you can make a change in the brain and that something about your personality fundamentally changes, what that shows is that your personality isn't who you are. That who you are is actually something higher than that. And I think he's mistaking personality and these different personality traits for the intellect. And he's also saying that that's our core being, is like our personality is our core being. But I think what we would say as Platonists is that what this shows is that our personalities are similarly transient and transitory, like our body is, that we may have somewhat different personalities here and there, and even variations of personality throughout our life. The kind of personality we have when we're 20 is not the same personality we have when we're 80. We can have vast differences, and it just shows that that is an aspect of us that changes and moves over time. It's not the core unchanging aspect of our being, which at the highest level is the intellect, but that's not your rational intellect. That's not like your mental machinations and thinking. It's awareness itself. It's the consciousness itself. And your conscious awareness doesn't change. The consciousness that you lived with and experienced when you were 2 years old is the same as when you're 80. It's the same continuity of experience itself, right? And your personality and your experiences and all of the sensible sense data you take in are things that are on top of that bare consciousness that's at the core bottom of your experiences, right? So if anything, this is just showing that there's something more immortal to who you are at your core that goes beyond even personality. And I think what's horrifying to him is it's like, yeah, your ego is going to get horrified at the idea that aspects of your personality are changeable, because a lot of us identify with our personalities as though our personalities are who we really are. But what we're saying as Platonists is that there's something much deeper to ourselves than just our personalities or our bodies. So I think that's enough for today on this one. And really the only thing left is their closing statements, but I'd rather actually save that for another video and get to kind of address this thing as a whole and kind of wrap the whole thing up. So I think we'll leave it there for now, and you guys have yourself a good day.